The locals mocked him for buying dead land with no water. They called him a fool, but he saw something they didn't. He noticed his sheep constantly gathering in one specific overgrown spot. What he uncovered beneath that brush didn't just save his farm, it made him an absolute fortune. The auctioneer didn't even bother to pull the microphone closer. He leaned over his wooden podium, scanned the room with a bored expression, and repeated the description for the third time. Lot 42. 150 acres. San Saba County, Texas. Mostly heavy mesquite brush. No existing well. No certified water source on record. Fencing is down. Selling as is. It was a blistering Tuesday morning in October 1998. The small community hall was packed with about 50 people, a mix of tired ranchers, land speculators in clean denim, and a few locals just looking for a bit of excitement. The mid-90s had been brutal for agriculture in Texas. People were holding onto their wallets, watching the auctions closely, waiting for the land prices to bottom out. When a parcel was listed with no water and heavy brush, it was essentially a polite way of saying the land was worthless. The auctioneer sighed, his gaze drifting over the crowd. He laid out the starting bid, $15,000. Silence filled the room. It was that heavy, uncomfortable kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the overhead fans. He dropped the price to $14,000. Nothing. He dropped it to $13,000. Not a single hand moved. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the front row. It was Vernon Cobb, a man who owned the biggest ranching operation in the county. He adjusted his oversized belt buckle, leaned back in his chair and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Save your breath, Charlie," Cobb shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "That property isn't a farm. It's a graveyard for dead wood. You're trying to sell firewood, not pasture." The room erupted in quiet chuckles. It was the kind of laughter that comes when everyone agrees on a painful truth. If the land were any good, someone would have cleaned that mesquite years ago. If there were water, it would have been developed decades ago. It was considered doomed ground, a tax burden disguised as a land deal. In the very back of the hall, leaning against the cold brick wall, stood Elias Vance. He was 38 years old, his hands calloused and stained with the kind of dirt that doesn't wash off. He wasn't dressed like the speculators. He didn't have the crisp, pressed shirt of a man who managed money. He had the worn-out flannel of a man who managed animals. He had driven 3 hours that morning in a truck that rattled every time he hit a pothole. He waited 3 seconds, just enough time for the auctioneer to start reaching for his gavel to declare the lot no sale. Elias didn't stand up. He didn't make a scene. He simply raised his right hand. The auctioneer's eyes widened slightly. $12,000? Elias nodded once, his face unreadable. The room went deathly quiet. A few heads turned around to look at the man in the back. Vernon Cobb stopped laughing and stared at Elias with a look of pure, bewildered pity. "Any higher?" the auctioneer called out, his voice suddenly sharp and professional. He looked at Vernon, then at the rest of the room. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted that brush. Nobody wanted the risk. Going once. Going twice. The gavel slammed down with a resounding crack that echoed off the high ceiling. Sold to the man in the back for $12,000. As the crowd began to disperse, the whispers started. "Poor guy," someone muttered. "He just spent his life savings on a pile of thorns." Elias didn't stick around to chat. He didn't care about the jokes. As he walked toward the exit, his hand brushed against the pocket of his jeans, where he kept a small, worn-out notebook. He knew exactly what he had just bought. The speculators saw a desert of mesquite brush. Elias saw something that hadn't been recorded on a map in 50 years. He wasn't buying firewood. He was buying a hidden fortune. Most of the people in that auction room thought they were watching a man make the biggest mistake of his life. They saw a desperate farmer throwing away his meager savings on a pile of worthless thorns. But they didn't know Elias Vance's situation. They didn't know what he was really running from. For the last 10 years, Elias had been building a small, hardy flock of Dorper sheep. They were tough animals, perfect for the dry Texas heat, but they required space to thrive. For a decade, Elias had been leasing 150 acres just outside of San Saba. It was a comfortable arrangement, a month-to-month handshake deal with an elderly neighbor who just wanted someone to keep the weeds down. Life was stable until the spring of 1998. The landowner passed away suddenly. The heirs didn't care about a handshake deal or a loyal tenant. They wanted the land sold immediately to settle the estate taxes. Elias received a formal notice. He had 30 days to vacate. He was about to lose his entire livelihood. Elias was not a rich man. His entire life savings sat in a dusty bank account at $2,500. He walked into the First State Bank in San Saba, begging for a loan to buy a small patch of decent land. The loan officer didn't even look up from his paperwork. Good, established pasture in San Saba County was trading at $900 an acre. To buy a plot big enough for his flock, he would need at least $100,000. The bank officer closed the folder and told him to come back when he had better collateral. Elias walked out of that bank feeling like the walls were closing in. He was desperate, but he wasn't reckless. He stopped sleeping through the night. Instead, he spent his evenings staring at every single auction notice in the county paper. He realized quickly that he couldn't compete with the big ranching operators for the prime green fields. If he wanted to own his own dirt, he had to find something that nobody else wanted. He had to find trash land. That's when he spotted the notice for the 150-acre parcel. It was overgrown with mesquite, a thorny, woody shrub that destroys pasture if it isn't managed. There were no wells, no fences, and no records of water. To the local speculators, it was completely useless. To them it was just a tax burden. But Elias had a hunch. He had spent his childhood trailing his grandfather, a man who claimed that land never truly dies, it only sleeps. 2 weeks before the auction, Elias pulled his old pickup truck off the quiet county road. He didn't call the real estate agent. He didn't ask for permission. He just pulled his boots on and started walking. It was a cold, gray Saturday morning. The mesquite brush was so thick that he had to hack his way through the thorns with a brush hook just to make a path. He walked for hours. His hands were scratched and his boots were heavy with mud. He wasn't looking for grass, there was none. He wasn't looking for a view. He was looking for evidence. His grandfather had taught him that even if a place looks dead on the surface, the history of the land is always written in the dirt. He was looking for 3 specific signs: ancient animal trails, signs of non-native vegetation, and disturbed stone. If he could find those, he would know this wasn't just worthless brush. He would know it was a forgotten opportunity. As he pushed deeper into the property, the wind died down and the silence became heavy. He knew the auction was only 14 days away. He had to find something or he was going to be out of the sheep business for good. He took a deep breath, gripped his walking stick, and kept moving into the heart of the thorns. Elias could still hear his grandfather's voice echoing in his head, sharp as a whip. The old man had survived the brutal droughts of the 1950s by reading the landscape like a map. "The land talks, Elias," he used to say while sitting on their front porch. "It doesn't scream, but it tells the truth. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. And you have to look in the right places." Elias stood in the middle of the dense, overgrown thicket, listening to the wind whistle through the mesquite thorns. He was tired, his legs ached, and his hope was fading. If he didn't find a reason to buy this land, he would be out of business by next month. He knelt, brushed the dirt from his knees, and started looking for the 3 things his grandfather had taught him to hunt for on neglected property: animal trails, out-of-place vegetation, and unnatural stone. The first sign was in the ground itself. He noticed the earth was harder than usual, a layer of limestone caliche that made it difficult for plants to grow. But as he crawled through the brush, he saw it. A path. It wasn't just a stray trail left by a deer or a coyote. It was a deep, compacted rut, almost like a groove worn into the hard stone. It was a ghost path, etched into the caliche from decades of hooves following the exact same line. Animals don't make trails like that unless they are heading somewhere important, somewhere that offers survival. Elias followed the faint groove. The brush got thicker, angrier with thorns, but the trail held steady. He pushed through, his shirt snagging on branches, until he reached a low-lying patch of ground where the mesquite finally broke. There he saw the second sign, the desert willows. It was mid-October and Texas was dry. Everything around him was brown, brittle, and dead. But these willows were different. They were vibrant, deep green, and lush. Willows don't grow on dry ground, they are thirsty plants. If they were this healthy in the middle of a drought, there was only one possible reason. There was water deep below the surface, or a seep line was feeding them from the rock. This wasn't just a patch of trees, it was a neon sign pointing at the ground. Elias walked toward the center of the grove. The air here felt cooler, almost damp. He knelt down right where the willows were thickest. He started kicking at the ground, clearing away a thick layer of dead leaves, rot, and dirt that had accumulated for 40 years. That's when he felt it. His boot hit something that didn't sound like dirt or rock. It sounded solid. He dropped to his hands and knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare fingers, ignoring the thorns that pricked his skin. He brushed away the soil and gasped. It wasn't a random rock. It was a perfectly square-cut limestone block. He cleared more of the area and found another block, then a corner. This was human-made masonry. Someone had built a structure here long ago, a well casing, a cistern, or a spring box, and then the land had been abandoned, letting the mesquite swallow it whole. Elias sat back on his heels, breathing hard. He hadn't just found a piece of brush land. He had found a piece of history. The land wasn't dead. It was just waiting for someone to clear the history away. He stood up, looked around the empty, overgrown property and smiled. He knew exactly what he was going to do. The diner in San Saba was the headquarters for every rumor in the county. On Tuesday mornings, the booths were filled with the same faces, drinking the same bitter coffee and discussing the same local business. 1 week after the auction, the main topic of conversation wasn't the weather or the price of feed. It was Elias Vance. Vernon Cobb sat in the biggest booth, his cowboy hat tipped back. He swirled his coffee and laughed. "I saw him out there yesterday," Vernon said loud enough for the cook to hear. "Dragging rusted wire across that mesquite hellscape. He thinks he's a rancher, but he's just a guy who likes manual labor. That land is nothing but thorns. There's no water. By Christmas, the bank will own that brush and Elias will be looking for a job at the feed store." The room chuckled. Everyone knew Vernon was the expert. If Vernon said the land was worthless, it was worthless. They all agreed that buying 150 acres of overgrown mess without a water source was a fool's errand. They were waiting for the inevitable failure. Elias wasn't there to hear it. He didn't have time for diner coffee. He was 3 miles out, deep in the mesquite. He didn't have the budget to clear the whole property or buy a herd of cattle. Every cent of his limited savings was tied up in the land purchase. He had a few $100s left for materials. He had to be smart. He didn't hire a fencing crew. He spent his weekends walking the property line with a pair of rusty fencing pliers, pulling old, sagging barbed wire tight and stapling it to crooked, weathered posts. His hands were raw, bleeding from the thorns, but he worked with a focus that kept him going. He wasn't fixing a fence, he was building a perimeter for his future. He knew he couldn't afford to risk his entire livelihood on a hunch. If he moved his whole flock onto the land and there was no water, his sheep would die within days. He had to be sure. Instead of bringing all his animals, Elias chose just 20 dry ewes, sheep that weren't nursing lambs. They were his test group. They were hardy, tough, and the best survivalists in his flock. On a Saturday morning in November, he opened the gate and drove them onto the property. As the truck pulled away, he stood by the fence and watched. He didn't want to herd them or force them to go anywhere. He wanted to see where they would go on their own. The 20 sheep stepped cautiously onto the dry, crunchy grass. They looked around, sniffing the air. The land was silent, covered in the gray-green haze of the mesquite. Elias held his breath, his notebook in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Would they stay near the gate? Would they wander off searching for a creek that didn't exist? For the first few hours they grazed the sparse, brown grass near the front. But then, as the sun began to climb higher, the behavior of the animals shifted. They stopped grazing. They lifted their heads, ears perking up, and turned toward the center of the property, toward the thick, overgrown cluster of desert willows where Elias had found the stone blocks. Elias clicked his pen. He was watching the experiment unfold. The sheep were starting to move. They weren't just walking. They were moving with a sense of purpose, as if they were following a map only they could read. The game was on. For the first 48 hours, Elias felt like he had made a terrible mistake. He watched from the fence line, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning for any sign of grazing. But his 20 test ewes weren't grazing. They were doing something else entirely. They ignored the open patches of sparse grass near the gate. They didn't settle in the shade of the large oaks that dotted the southern edge of the property. Instead, they acted as if they were drawn by an invisible magnet. Every single one of them had walked straight into the thickest, most tangled mess of mesquite brush on the entire 150 acres. The exact spot where Elias had found the square limestone block 2 weeks prior. "What are you doing?" Elias whispered to himself, his hand trembling slightly as he jotted a note in his worn-out ledger. The first day he assumed it was just a fluke. Maybe they were looking for shelter from the wind. But by the second day the pattern became clear. The sheep weren't resting. They were restless. They spent their afternoons standing in the dense brush, huddled together, looking toward the ground. There was no forage value there. The mesquite had choked out any grass that might have grown in that thicket years ago. There was no water tank. There was no mineral block. By the third day the situation became alarming. The sheep were starting to show signs of thirst. Their coats looked a little duller and their movements were sluggish. Any normal, logical farmer would have panicked, opened the gate and loaded them back onto the trailer to save them. But Elias stayed put. He knew that if he intervened now he would never know the truth. He moved closer, stepping carefully through the thorns, trying not to spook them. When he was within 20 feet he froze. The behavior he witnessed sent a chill down his spine. The ewes weren't just standing around. They were pawing at the hard, dry dirt. They were kicking and scratching at the surface with their hooves, right at the base of the tallest mesquite trees, inches away from where Elias had found that cut limestone corner. One ewe, a stubborn old girl he'd raised from a lamb, was licking the dry stone, her eyes wide, her head bobbing as if she could smell moisture deep beneath the soil. Elias knelt behind a bush, holding his breath. It clicked. This wasn't a random place they had chosen. It was a memory. His grandfather used to tell him that animals have a genetic memory of water. Even if a well had been covered for 50 years, even if the brush had grown over the spot, the animals knew the land's history better than any map or county record. They were congregating there because that was where the water had been. They were waiting for the ground to give it back to them. He opened his notebook and wrote in bold, shaky letters, Day 3. Sheep congregated at the north thicket, pawing and licking the stone. Not grazing. They are looking for the source. He closed the notebook and looked at the sky. He had 20 animals betting their lives that there was water beneath that limestone. Elias looked at the brush, then at the dirt. He realized he wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a detective, and the land was finally starting to give him a lead. 3 weeks of November had burned by, and the situation on the property was becoming dire. The 20 ewes were starting to look gaunt. Their wool was dusty, their energy was low, and their ribs were beginning to show through their coats. The promise of the land had not materialized, and the experiment looked more like a tragedy in the making. Elias stood by the fence line watching the sheep, when a cloud of dust announced a visitor. A brand new charcoal-gray pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road and skidded to a stop near the front gate. Out stepped Vernon Cobb, his boots polished, his hat crisp, and his attitude as condescending as ever. He walked over to the fence, leaning against it with a smirk that looked like it had been carved into his face. "Still playing rancher, are you, Elias?" Vernon asked, looking past him at the sheep. "I've been watching you for weeks. Those sheep look terrible. They're losing weight, not gaining. You're starving them on this scrubland." He pointed toward the dense, thick brush. "Look at it. It's a complete waste of time. Cut your losses, sell the property for whatever you can get, and go back to working for someone else. You're going to lose everything if you keep pushing this." Elias didn't say a word. He just stared at the mesquite. He couldn't explain the logic to a man like Vernon. Vernon shook his head, laughed a hollow, unkind laugh, and got back in his truck. He drove off, leaving Elias standing in a cloud of exhaust and frustration. But the worst was yet to come. 2 days later, a sedan pulled up, the loan officer from the bank. He didn't even get out of the car. He rolled down the window and handed Elias a letter. It was a formal denial. "We've reviewed your request for an operating line of credit, Elias," the officer said, his voice flat and impersonal. "We can't do it. We had an appraiser look at this parcel. It's 150 acres of mesquite brush with no water. It doesn't qualify as collateral. In our eyes, this land is worth no more than what you paid for it. Without a verified water source, it's just a liability." The officer rolled up his window and pulled away, leaving Elias standing in the dirt with the rejection letter in his hand. Elias felt the weight of the world crashing down. His lease on the old land had officially expired yesterday. He had nowhere to take the rest of his flock. He had 20 test sheep that were failing, a bank that viewed his land as trash, and a neighbor who was just waiting for him to fail so he could laugh about it at the diner. He looked out at the thicket. He was broke. He was alone. He was out of time. If he didn't find the water today, he was finished. He was going to lose his sheep, his savings, and his future. He walked toward the thicket, gripping his shovel like it was a weapon. It was all or nothing now. Saturday morning didn't bring any relief. The sun rose, harsh and unforgiving, over the San Saba brush. Elias pulled his rusted Ford tractor onto the property, the engine sputtering and coughing, sounding like a dying animal in the quiet morning air. This was it. This was the final gamble. He had no more credit, no more lease, and the sheep were growing weaker by the day. He didn't bother trying to clear the whole lot. He drove straight for the gathering spot, the thicket where the ewes had been pawing the dirt for weeks. The sheep didn't run away. They stood back near the fence line, their ears twitching, watching him with an eerie, collective intensity. It felt as if they knew exactly what he was about to do. Elias hopped down from the tractor seat. He grabbed a heavy logging chain from the toolbox and wrapped it around the trunk of a dead, dry mesquite stump that sat directly over the center of the site. He hooked it tight. He wasn't trying to clear the land for farming anymore. He was mining for an answer. He climbed back onto the tractor, shoved the lever into low gear, and eased the throttle open. The engine roared, the tires dug into the dry, loose soil, and the tractor lurched forward. Crack. The chain pulled taut, biting into the stump. The mesquite wood groaned. Elias gave it more gas, bracing himself for the stump to pop out of the ground. But instead of coming loose, the tractor suddenly bucked and stalled. The rear tires spun, throwing up a cloud of dust, but the machine wouldn't move an inch forward. Elias cursed and jumped off the tractor. He thought he had snagged a massive rock or a deep, stubborn root system. He grabbed a heavy-duty shovel from the tractor fender and started digging. He scraped the dirt away from where the chain was hooked, expecting to see a root, but his shovel struck something flat and hard. It wasn't a root. It was stone. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped the shovel and started clearing the dirt with his bare, gloved hands. He brushed away years of packed silt, dead leaves and thorns. As the layer of dirt vanished, the shape emerged. It wasn't just a random rock, it was a perfectly fitted stone curb, a massive circular cap made of hand-cut limestone. Elias stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had seen photos of these in history books, but he'd never seen one in the wild. This was an 1890 stone spring box, a masterfully built underground cistern designed to catch water from the deep earth. He grabbed a pry bar from the tractor. With a grunt of effort, he wedged it under the edge of the stone cap and leaned his entire weight into it. The heavy stone groaned, shifted, and finally tilted back. A damp, cool smell drifted up from the opening, a smell that shouldn't exist in the middle of a Texas drought. Elias shone his flashlight into the hole. It was a nightmare of decay. The shaft was choked with decades of mud, twisted mesquite roots, and rotting debris. It looked like a tomb. But at the very bottom, buried under the filth, he saw it. A puddle. Dark, wet, and glistening mud. The spring wasn't dead, it was just suffocated. He sat on the edge of the curb, breathing in the smell of damp earth, his hands trembling. He had found it. The water was there. All he had to do now was set it free. Elias couldn't believe his luck. On Monday morning he was at the county archives in San Saba, digging through dusty, forgotten records. He finally found it, an original land survey plat from 1902. Right there, in the northeast corner of his parcel, was a small hand-drawn symbol. It was marked Artisan Seep. The land hadn't just been random brush, it had been a functioning homestead. It had been mapped, used, and then erased by time. He had the proof, but he still needed a system. He called a local well drilling company, mostly just to see what a professional would charge to get water to the surface. The man on the phone didn't even come out to look at the property. New well, casing, pump, and electrical lines? The driller asked. You're looking at a minimum of $24,500. Elias hung up the phone and laughed. He didn't have $24,000. He barely had $2,400. And he didn't need a high-tech electric pump system. He just needed the water that nature was already providing. He decided to do it himself. For the next 3 weekends, Elias lived in a hole in the ground. He hauled a 5-gallon bucket, a shovel, and a heavy-duty brush hook out to the spring box. Every Saturday and Sunday he descended into the dark, muck-filled cistern. It was brutal, back-breaking work. The mud was thick, smelling of rotting vegetation and decades of stagnant water. He scooped it out by hand, bucket by bucket, careful not to disturb the original limestone foundation. He found the culprit quickly, an old, rusted iron pipe that had long ago collapsed under the weight of the shifting earth. It hadn't been delivering water for years, it had been choking the flow. Elias drove to the hardware store and bought the basics: long-lasting PVC pipe, a few elbow fittings and a sturdy plastic stock trough. He spent his final weekend carefully laying the new pipe, running it from the spring box, downhill to a clearing about 40 feet away. Because the spring was naturally situated on a slight slope, he didn't need a pump. He just needed gravity. He sealed the connections, cleared the path and then waited. Slowly, almost painfully at first, the water began to move. It trickled through the new PVC pipe, clear and cold, and began to fill the plastic trough. Within a few hours the tank was full. Elias sat on the ground, wiping mud from his face, watching the water ripple in the afternoon sun. The total cost for his materials, the PVC, the fittings and the trough, was exactly $720. He pulled out his notebook and did the math. A professional well would have cost him $24,500. By doing the work himself, he had saved over $23,700. He had taken a worthless piece of land and for less than $1,000, turned it into a functioning, self-sustaining ranch. He didn't need a massive bank loan or an expensive contractor. He just needed a shovel, some grit, and the common sense to follow the land's history. He had won the first round. Now it was time to see if the land could hold up under the heat of a Texas summer. With the water source confirmed and the system running, Elias moved his entire flock of 200 sheep onto the property in the spring of 1999. He held his breath. He had bet his entire life on this patch of worthless brush, and now he was finally going to find out if he had won. Nature didn't go easy on him. Summer 1999 hit Texas with a vengeance. It was one of the hottest, driest seasons the county had seen in a decade. Ponds across the region evaporated into cracked, muddy pits. Creeks that had flowed for generations stopped dead. The heat was relentless, baking the ground until it turned into concrete. Elias checked his trough every single morning at first light. Every morning the water was there. The spring box, fed by the deep, cool earth, never slowed down. It filled the trough, overflowed, and kept his animals hydrated without him spending a single penny. Across the road the story was very different. Vernon Cobb's ranch was suffering. His ponds were dry and his livestock were panting in the shade, dying of thirst. Every morning at 6 a.m., Vernon had to back a water truck up to his dry lots. He was paying $60 a day just to haul in water to keep his herd alive. That was $1,800 a month in pure loss, just for water, just to keep his animals from dying. Elias watched Vernon's truck rumble past his gate every day, kicking up dust. He didn't gloat, but he couldn't help but notice the irony. While Vernon was spending thousands of dollars just to stay even, Elias was spending zero. By October the payoff arrived. The lamb crop came off in excellent condition. Despite the brutal drought, his sheep had thrived because they had never gone thirsty. He sold the entire lot at the market in San Saba. When the check cleared, the math was staggering, $14,200 in profit. It was the best payday of his life. But the real victory happened a week later. Elias called the bank. He didn't ask for a loan this time. He invited the appraiser back out to look at the land. This time the appraiser didn't look at it from the road. He walked the property. He saw the working spring box. He saw the clear, cold water filling the troughs. He saw the healthy, thriving flock. He saw the property for what it truly was, not brush land, but a self-sustaining ranch with a proven water source. The appraiser went back to the office and wrote a new report. The land Elias had purchased for $12,000, the land everyone said was a waste of money, was officially reappraised at $52,500. Elias sat at his kitchen table and did the math one more time. He had bought the land for $12,000. He had spent $720 on the water fix. He had made $14,200 on the first lamb sale alone. And his land value had jumped by more than $40,000. The doubters were gone. The bank's denial was a distant memory. He had looked at a pile of thorns and seen a diamond. He had won. The annual Farm Bureau meeting in January was always a formal affair. Men in clean, starched shirts gathered to talk about crop yields, government subsidies, and tax breaks. Elias stood by the coffee station, comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't the fool with the brush farm anymore. He was the guy who had made it work when the rest of the county had burned. Vernon Cobb approached him. The arrogance was completely gone. Vernon looked older, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had been fighting a losing battle against the weather. The drought had taken its toll on his row crop operation, and the cost of survival had been high. He didn't have his usual smirk. He walked up to Elias, looked down at his own dusty boots for a moment, and then met Elias's eyes with a look of genuine defeat. "I spent $8,000 on water trucks this summer," Vernon said quietly. "You didn't try to hide it. $8,000 just to keep my herd from dying while you were sitting on a spring that nobody knew existed." Elias nodded slowly. He didn't gloat. There was no point. The land had already taught the lesson. Vernon paused, clearly struggling with the question that had been eating at him for months. He had seen the land, he had judged the land, and he had been dead wrong. "I've lived here 30 years, Elias. I know every rock and every tree on this side of the county. I looked at that property. I saw nothing but dead wood. How in the hell did you know the water was there?" Elias smiled. He looked across the room at the other farmers who were all watching, waiting to hear the answer. "I didn't know, Vernon. That's the thing. I didn't see the water. I saw the sheep." "The sheep?" Vernon asked, frowning.
"The sheep knew," Elias explained. "They knew where the water had been for 100 years, even though we had forgotten. The mesquite grew over it, the records were lost, and we thought the land was dead. But the animals were still going to where the water had been. They were just waiting for someone to pay attention. They didn't need a map. They didn't need a driller. They just needed me to watch them." Vernon stayed quiet for a long time. He finally nodded, a gesture of respect he wouldn't have given 6 months ago. He had spent his whole life relying on modern equipment, row crop efficiency, and loud opinions. He had ignored the very thing that mattered, the land itself. It is a dangerous thing to think you know more than the landscape you farm. Experts will tell you what's profitable, what's standard, and what's impossible. They will tell you that a piece of brush is worthless because it doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. But nature isn't a spreadsheet. It keeps its secrets in the roots, in the trails, and in the behavior of the creatures that walk it. Elias had succeeded not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he was quiet enough to listen to what the animals were saying. The county still called it brush, but Elias knew better. He knew it was home. If you want more incredible farming stories about reading the land and beating the odds, hit the subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below if you have ever seen animals outsmart the experts.